right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our BCBA 5th edition task list series. Today we're continuing with behavior assessment and F3, socially significant behavior change goals. With this particular task list item, we're going to go through a series of questions you should ask yourself when preparing to choose goals. I'm not saying we need to memorize these questions. I'm saying you want to take these questions and start thinking critically about them as we move forward into different assessments and identifying and creating goals. So again, it's not a memorization thing, it's an applied thing. So we're going to ask these questions, go through these questions, and then take those questions and start applying them to other areas of the task list. So as always, check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. Our exams are now both printable and digital, so you can study however fits your style. Let us know when you pass so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. Socially significant change. In applied behavior analysis, the applied means we're looking for meaningful, socially valid changes. So we're not only selecting behavior for the benefit of others. For example, I want my kid to be more quiet. I want them to be less annoying. Is the behavior we're targeting for change actually going to make a difference in somebody's life? Or is it just, quote unquote, a kid being a kid? We've got to consider these things because when you start taking on clients, you've got a limited amount of time and a limited number of resources to use to try to make the biggest impact possible. So you can't go in and say, well, I'm going to set 20 goals. It's a lot of goals. You have to be smart about what are we ultimately trying to achieve. So what you want to consider is habilitation. Not to be confused with habituation, but habilitation is when we maximize a person's repertoire, so their behaviors, their skills, where they are contacting short and long-term reinforcement, not in the training environment alone, but also in the generalized environment, and then minimizing punishers. And so especially if you're working with kids with autism or other disabilities, we want to start working on how can we get them contacting reinforcement more socially? How can we get them contacting reinforcement more at an academic level, at all these different levels where previously they might have been encountering punishment? So that's going to lead us to socially significant change, meaningful change. So let's ask ourselves these questions. Number one, will the behavior produce reinforcement in the client's natural environment after treatment ends? Always, always, always back to generalization. If we're not generalizing, we're not doing our job. Your focus has to be on generalization. We don't hope, we don't pray, we plan for generalization. You're not generalizing, you're not doing your job. Two, is the behavior a prerequisite for a useful skill? Now, if you're working with, let's say, early learners or kids who are severely impacted, then you might be starting at a much different spot than, let's say, a very high functioning, quote unquote, kid or a low impacted kid. And so we can't always jump to the finish line. Sometimes we're going to teach steps or prereqs for useful skills. And those are meaningful as long as we're building towards something else. And so if you're going to be teaching these prereqs, learn how to explain that to parents who sometimes can only see the finish line. And it's difficult for them to see long-term changes. And so you've got to get good at explaining why you're teaching that skill and what it means for the future of that kid's or client's behavior. Three, will the behavior increase the client's access to important and beneficial environments where they can learn other behaviors? So the example that immediately springs to mind here is kids in school who might be in more self-contained rooms or who might not spend a lot of time in a general education environment. Can we get them more access to those general education settings? Or how about just a family who wants to be able to go out to eat or go to the mall? Those are beneficial environments that we want to start to increase the client's access to. Because when we think about especially autism and the social impact it has on our clients, we want to start changing their behavior, which allows them to access previously inaccessible environments, because they're going to start to learn behaviors from those other environments. Four, will the behavior change lead to others to interact with the client more supportively and appropriately? For being very honest here, it can be sometimes challenging working with the populations we work with. And so engaging with those clients and those people on a day-to-day basis for other peers or other educators or other therapists can pose quite a challenge. And so what we're trying to ask with number 4 is, what behaviors can we alter or change where their social interactions are going to improve? And so think about maybe specifically peer interaction. We can't always fault the other side, right? We can't just fault the peers in the social environment when sometimes there are barriers based on behavior that our clients are putting up where it's just difficult for peers to engage with them. And so if we can change things like maybe they communicate better, or they share better, or they empathize better, those are all behavior changes where they will get more supportive and appropriate interaction from the social environment. So you can see all 4 of these are really looking at how are we changing their interaction with the environment. We've always got to think about that. If I succeed and I reach my goal, and we reach our behavior goal, what change in the environment has that produced? We have to ask ourselves that question. 5, is the behavior a behavior cusp or pivotal behavior? Cusps and pivotal behaviors, very blurry, very confusing. Don't get bogged down in what a cusp and what a pivotal behavior is. You ask 3 different analysts, you'll get 3 different answers. Just think about a cusp as a learner performing a new behavior that leads them to new environments. So crawling and walking obviously lead to new environments, new reinforcement, reading, imitation. And then think of pivotal behaviors as behavior that modifies other untrained behaviors. So the ability to self-initiate, to make choices, self-management. So in a way, cusps are much more concrete, while pivotal behaviors are much broader, where self-initiation and choice-making aren't specific behaviors per se, but they happen in different situations and can lead to these untrained behaviors. Don't get bogged down, though, with cusp versus pivotal behavior. Just know behavior cusps and pivotal behaviors, especially with young learners, are extremely socially significant. So ask yourself, if I teach this behavior, what is that ultimately going to produce later on? 6, is the behavior age appropriate? Now, we want to be careful with this idea of age appropriate, especially if you're working with kids with developmental delays, where their age might not necessarily meet their developmental level. And so you've got to keep that in mind, where if you're working with a 15-year-old who might have a developmental level of 7 or 8 years old, you've got to keep that in mind when choosing those behaviors. So the behavior not only age appropriate, but also developmentally appropriate. 7, what will the replacement behavior if you are reducing a behavior? So if you're reducing a behavior, what is the rule? Well, we've got to replace it with something. That's the fair pair rule. Behaviors serve a purpose. That's their function. They allow the learner to engage with the environment, to make changes in the environment to meet needs. And so if you're going to take a behavior away by reducing it, you've got to give them a different way to meet that same need, or else that behavior is just going to come back. So you're always asking yourself, what is my replacement? If you don't have a replacement, we need to find one. 8, does the behavior represent an actual problem or goal? Now, early on in a lot of your client life cycles, this isn't going to be an issue because you're going to be addressing a lot of pressing needs. But let's say you're a year into service and you've met a bunch of goals, and now you're at the point where you're working on things, but they're not as significant or serious as earlier. When we get to that point, you really have to start asking yourself, are we actually achieving anything here? Or are we just making modifications because that's what we've been doing? So 8 is a question that you have to be honest with yourself about. Can I actually achieve any more meaningful goals or problems here? If not, I need to potentially move on from this particular client because I can no longer produce socially significant changes. And that's a difficult conversation to have with yourself. It's a very honest conversation to have with yourself. 9, does the behavior actually exist or is it just spoken or talked about? Meaning, have you seen it? Have you seen the behavior? And if you do this long enough, you're going to start to understand that every day is a new behavior, a new thing. And before you jump in to writing treatment plans and designing assessments, see it for yourself. See if it happens again. See if it's repeatable. Because so many times behavior happens once, we never see it again. So, does it actually exist in the way it's talked about, or is it simply just talked about? And then 10, what if the goal is not a behavior necessarily? What do we mean by this? Well, losing weight, gaining friends, being successful, being creative, being a good sport, these aren't necessarily concrete behaviors. They're like these abstract concepts. And so we can target these. We just need to figure out what behaviors make up the idea of losing weight. Maybe it's dietary changes. What about gaining friends? What goes back to our social behaviors? What about being successful? Maybe that's time management. And so we can target goals that aren't necessarily discrete behaviors and responses, but we need to figure out what's going to lead us to accomplishing those goals. So, those are our 10 questions we want to ask ourselves. We're not memorizing those because what you're going to do is take those 10 questions and start applying them throughout the task list. When you're thinking about experimental designs, when you're thinking about measurement, when you're thinking about goal writing, are you asking yourself these questions? Especially as we get into analyses and assessments, these questions become very, very important. We can't work on everything because it's just not possible. We don't have enough time and resources. And we want to maximize our time and resources to provide the best services that we can. So identifying socially significant changes, while a pretty abstract concept, it's a very important concept. So don't overlook this one. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have a new task list video every week, so subscribe to get updates on that. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials. Please let us know when you pass so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. We'll see you soon.